There it goes. Okay, great. Thanks, Dan. Okay, welcome today to the Podman community meeting. Today is March 17th, 2022. We have a number of topics in line for today. We are going to be talking about Etsy hosts, and I have a misspelling in the agenda, so I'll try and fix that up. In containers, Paul Holzinger will be leading us off with that. We're also going to be talking about macOS volume mounts with Brent Baude. And then Dan Walsh, we will be talking about Podman Pod Create and when should a container exit after that happens. I will ask that folks go ahead and sign up in the HackMD. If you have not already done so, I will add a link again because I know Google Meet sometimes trashes those into the chat here. And with that, I will also ask that since today is St. Patrick's Day, that you be wearing green or have a green background or turn your video off. And we will get started now. Paul, please kick us off.
All right, let's see if I can share my screen here. So, can you see the screen?
We can.
All right. I guess I need to make it a bit bigger for some folks here.
Yep. That's good.
You know us too well.
So basically, what I want to talk about is some etc host changes. So we have a couple of open issues which have some problems with how we automatically generate entries in there. So there are a couple of problems, like currently we don't support with Podman network disconnect and connect. We need to modify etc hosts to like change to the new network information, basically remove or add entries depending on if we connect or disconnect. Then we have problems with some users don't want to use us that the etc host from the actual host as base, so we leak entries from the host, which is the question: how do we want to make this configurable? And another problem right now is pods entries with how should the file look with pods and containers, how does it work together? So I have written down a couple of points here. Just want to go quick over them, and then if anyone wants to add something, please interrupt me. So the first point, if we generate a host file for a container, we read the etc host from the host and use the entries from there. If they are not already present, we add localhost entries, and then we add entries that were given via the -- add hosts flag from like Podman run, for example, or however they entries are given, like via API or some other inputs. And then we have a couple of different network modes, network none. Then in this case, we should just add the localhost IP and the container name. And for slip for NetNS, we add the slip IP, which is usually like 10.0.2.100, I believe, with the container name. And we use right now we use the public like an interface IP from the host as the hosts.containers.internal entry for bridge, for the bridge mode. So the bridge mode includes like other networks like MacVLAN and so on. We like internally it's called bridge, but it means all networks basically from like CNI or NetApp. In this case, we use the IP from the bridge or the MacVLAN network which we store, and yeah, so all these entries always add the container name and host name for the container. So the first question here would be: if we have several networks, should we add entries for all networks? Should we add only for the first. So that would be a question to maybe Matt, if you have an opinion there. Right now, we only do the first. So
as long as we're not adding duplicate entries, I mean, ideally we would combine duplicate entries, because you could have, how to put this, if we have two separate entries for, would that actually happen though? I'm thinking of different aliases you could have in different containers, but that shouldn't actually affect hosts. So
that shouldn't affect hosts. So.
yeah, I think there is no harm in doing it so long as we don't add duplicates then. We shouldn't even try and merge them. We should just, if there are two entries for a given host, we should take the first one that's added and exclude the others. How does that sound?
So what you are saying is if a user has given us a custom entry, or because if we have different networks, we have also like different IPs, and etc host, the IP is always the first, and then you just add the list of names behind it, right?
Yeah, basically I'm saying that if there is already an entry for something, then we should not modify it, which means that user entries basically trump all, and then anything we add in priority order.
Okay. So that's pretty much what I don't think we check for user entries before we add our entries at the moment. So that's definitely something. Let me write this down below. Do not override user entries. So yeah, and another problem right now is host.containers internal entry. So for bridge, I think that works. We can use the bridge IP. That should work fine. But currently we have a problem that we added several times when we are in a pod. So that must be fixed. So I think that's basically the same as you said before, that we should make sure to not add an entry twice. And so with pods, there's a case. So we use when you start a pod, you have the infra container, and that gets created etc host file, and we just append there. So there are a couple of problems with that. Right now we don't add the containers entries, and that's caused some problems. But if we add the container entries, the question is, what IP do we add? We could use the localhost IP. That was done in the past, but it caused issues with some, I believe, with Python interpreter. If you ask for the host name and want the IP, you get returned the localhost IP instead of the interface IP from Ethernet 0, basically. So the question here is, if you have a pod, how exactly the containers should be in the etc host file with what IP, and that's a bit tricky, I think.
Can we do a localhost IP that's not 127.0.0.1? Technically speaking, anything in 127.xyz is localhost. We could potentially do 127.0.0.10.
That was also done in the past, and that also didn't work. So I remember, I need to dig up the GitHub issues with that, but the problem with these localhost entries is that if you call the libraries, which, like, if you query your own host name, it gets resolved to the localhost IP, which seems to not the behavior people want when they want their host entry. So basically, if you call bind on your host name, it wouldn't bind it would only bind localhost, which is not what the people expect.
So can we do the public IP or?
Yeah, that's what I would go with the public IP in this case. So the container IP on Ethernet 0 or whatever.
That seems reasonable to me.
Okay, so let me write this down.
You also missed the option. Some people want the no host option, which is basically says use the host file that's in the image.
Use the host, yeah. That's yeah. I didn't thought of this, but of course, yeah. Then we don't even come to this code path in this case.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So we want to use for pods. The container should use the Ethernet 0 IP. Remote pod. Edit once. So there are some questions are about disabling the host from containers internal entry. So I think that's a reasonable behavior, but how should such an option look like? I think that's I would rather not add a new CLI option for this. So
Well, how would we do it other than a new command line option? You have the existing --add host, but that adds hosts. I don't think we can reasonably say that subtracts hosts just based on the name.
So I think we could maybe a special case do the default add hosts is already hosts.containers internal. And then you could maybe set add hosts and then an empty entry or something to override this. I'm not sure, but maybe another CLI option would be fine, but I don't know if it might get out of hand. We have no hosts, add hosts, and then some other hosts. And then we also have the next point. If we allow users to change the base host file where we pick entries from, that would also need some sort of option. So maybe we can.
Is there actually a request for that? I remember the no host request. I don't remember people asking to use the image. Excuse me, the images.
Well, no host actually implies that you're going to use the images.
Yeah, but there is basically an ask that you use the one from the image, but still make Podman generate the entries, so that you still have the container name in it. And
could we add these as just options to the --net? Would that make sense?
It would be more complicated because we would need to pass it in different ways with network bridge and slip and none.
I also don't think it makes sense because you can have multiple networks, but you only have one set of Etsy host settings.
Yeah, that would.
Yeah. So the obvious one will be that. Well, right now, what happens if I do a no host and an add host? Right now, I think we conflict them. So if we didn't conflict those, then potentially we could satisfy the user's request, although we wouldn't use the generated ones. So they could add content to the Etsy host file and use the one from the image. But they'd have to do it manually, not something we would.
Yeah, exactly. I think the interesting use case is that Podman adds you the container name in there on its own and not.
Yeah, I think people are looking at it from a security point of view that if we add information from the Etsy host from the host system, then that's potentially a information leak. And similar with this host containers that internal gives you a way to attack the system.
Yeah, we leak the system's IP in the container basically with that. Yeah. So I think the base etc host file, we could make it a path. You could give it a path maybe, and then the default is the etc host from the host, obviously, and you could maybe have a special value which would pick the image ones, which would just be image or something. But and then you could maybe set it in containers.conf. Not sure if you would need a extra CLI flag, because I guess most users wouldn't want to customize this for each container.
Yeah, I think putting something like that in containers.conf would be fine. And then I think just let's not conflict add host and no host, because then I can do it per container.
But that's the problem. I think the problem why it's conflicting right now would be that we bind mount an etc host, and if we use the image one, we would need to directly write into image, so the image would be already.
Oh, you mean modify the image or?
Yeah, that would be the question. If you would first
usually
bind mount it again.
Right now, we're establishing the image. We're establishing the etc host file via copying it from etc host into the container storage. So we could copy the etc host file from the image into container storage and then just add to it. And
there is precedence for directly modifying, though. We do that with etc password in certain circumstances. The problem is that doesn't work with read-only containers. So we need the code path where we copy it anyways. Honestly, I don't know if I'd even bother with the deconflicting. Just making an option in containers.conf to source from images etc host as opposed to the host's etc host seems reasonable enough to me. Most of the concern here seems to be security-wise. I don't really think people would want to switch this on or off on a per container basis.
Right.
Hi, so I'm Lance. I'm the one that submitted that aardvark issue 82. And so if I can add my 2 cents here.
You can.
So the problem that I'm running into is, I've got a lot of containers running on the same network, and it's unclear. Like if you're using the image hosts, which image host is taking precedence? Right? I have lots of containers. They all have their own hosts, potentially their own host image. And so the option that I was promoting was essentially trying to be able to configure that at runtime instead of image time. And so if we're
what's your end goal? So you want all the containers to share the same etc host?
The opposite. I mean,
Okay.
it's nice. The default is, if they're all on the same network, maybe they all have the same hosts. But in some cases, like in my particular case, I wanted to have 2 containers running off the same image that were each pointing at a different IP for the same host name. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So that should be configured via the add host option, basically, if you want to give a specific host name into the container.
Right, but that add host is network wide. So it doesn't seem that there's any way at the moment to say this particular container gets this particular set of hosts.
Couldn't that be done with a pod?
No,
Well, not if they're all on the same network.
Yeah, so that issue we ironed out, for 82. I thought, it seemed like a fairly clean solution to me. It does require adding another option. It was kind of difficult to overload any of the other ones without it getting really confusing. But being able to specify a host on the command line and then just kind of outlining what the impact of no hosts is, where those, the meeting of those two seems fairly straightforward from an explanation perspective.
Lance, could I ask you to cut and paste the issue or the PR that you're referring to into the chat, please? You broke up just a little bit as you said the numbers.
Sorry, let's see here.
No problem.
Is the chat in the Google Meet, or are you talking about on the MD?
Yes, in the Google Meet, please, would be fine.
Oh, I see it over here. Let's send to chat.
Thank you.
There we go. Did that come through?
Yes, it did. Thank you.
Yeah. So I mean, the issue 82. I mean, and I guess in some ways there are two separate issues. One is the options to control Etsy hosts. The other is, and it seems like maybe it's a larger question, is the fact that hosts are shared among all the containers. I mean, that might be, I don't know if that's a core tenet of container networking or not.
Well, they're not. It's not really shared between the containers. I mean, the Etsy host, the system is shared between all the containers, but each container is going to get their own Etsy host, modified version of the host Etsy host. So if I had two containers running on a system, they won't be able to connect to each other via the Etsy host file, via the names, or aliases. That only works if they're inside the same pod. If I could create container A and container B, container A does not see container B's Etsy host entry.
Yeah, not via host. It works via aardvark instead, so DNS.
But it wouldn't be in the Etsy host file. If A wanted to ping B, it would have to know that that's in DNS, not in Etsy host.
Right. So the add host option is modifying aardvark's resolving.
No.
It's just modifying Etsy host file for
Yeah,
that container.
if you add host, only writes like the line into etc hosts for this specific container. And the DNS option is like the DNS is basically for the whole network always, so you can resolve it via DNS. But that's also something you can turn off for the whole network when you disable DNS.
Okay, well that wasn't my experience. My experience was when I added a host to container A, container B knew about it, which I don't
You know the name?
I'm trying to think I don't know if I put it into this.
Yeah.
If that's true, that definitely sounds like a bug right there. We could be doing that, but if we are, it's definitely not intentional.
Yeah, maybe. Do you use pods? Do you have pods instead of containers?
I thought somebody said Etsy hosts are shared among all of the.
It's shared in a pod. It will be shared among all containers. So
In a pod.
That would be in a pod, yeah.
But if the containers are unique or in different pods, then they don't share the Etsy host.
All right. Well, I will look into that further. I mean, like I do have a number of pods and a number of containers.
Yeah. But if you find that you just run two containers, and we can verify this ourselves too,
Yeah.
and you add a host to container A, B should not be able to reach that by name. It should not be in DNS. But if it is, then we probably have a bug in Podman.
So add host should only affect essentially the pod.
Add host should be just affecting the Etsy host file inside of the container the containers.
But it is shared between the pod. It's also shared between containers that share a network namespace. If you do -net equals container : name, it'll share there as well.
Okay, so that's my
Okay.
right. So that's my issue, because I need to be like, right, and it's somewhat confusing to say, well, if you're on the default network, all the networking works this way, but if you create your own network, it's entirely different.
But if you add two containers to the same network namespace, they're actually in the same. We consider them both having the same IP address.
Right, but if I've got
Yes. Though the reason we share hosts in that is largely Docker compat. Docker is always shared host between containers that share network namespaces. We carried that over to pods because the network NS is shared. That doesn't necessarily have to be a requirement. But now we're starting to add more config options.
So the bottom line is, if you want two containers to be on separate IP addresses, then you don't share the network namespace between them.
Right, but if they're not on the same network namespace,
They don't share the Etsy localhost.
then you would have two different networks with different pods. I'm trying to think.
Well, they're on the same network, but they can't reach each other via name. Well, they could if they're using IBAC DNS.
Right, because if they're in different networks, they're isolated from each other. Right, so if I've got, because what I'm trying to do is if I have two front-end servers and I want to point one of them like for testing or staging or whatever, I want to point that one, I want it to use all the services within that network except one database. Right, I can't just pull that whole thing out into a new network because then it has no access to all the other back-end services, Redis and all the other stuff, right?
Yeah.
So in this case, you would want to split it out in like two networks. Basically, you have like the front end network, which connects like your front end server, so HTTP proxy or whatever, and then connects to the backend service. And the backend service is joined to two networks, in the front end network and the backend network. And on the backend network, you would connect like your database and the service which needs the access to the database.
Yeah, the solution here sounds like connecting to you'd have one container connected to both the front end and back end networks handling your proxying, and then everything else would be either front end only or back end only.
Yeah. I think we have to. I think we're going to have to table this conversation right now because we've already used up a half the meeting.
Yeah.
So we can continue the conversation and the issue, and we can continue. I think Lance is. Let's continue to work inside the issue on what you want, and I think we can continue going on the other assumption that there's also security ramifications to this, the leaking information to the container. So I think a lot of the stuff that Paul's been looking at still makes sense, but we can continue. Lance, let's continue this conversation and the issue, and then let's move on to the other two issues, other two topics, so we can cover everything in case there's other people interested in the other topics.
And sorry, I was trying to remove somebody from the call here who's displaying some screen views that shouldn't be seen on here. Yes, and just for reference, if Marco Silva tries to get back in, please do not allow him. All right, so our next topic, before we move on, Paul, could you make a PDF of your document, please, and I'll add it to the notes?
Yes, of course.
Thank you. Okay, so the next one up was macOS volume mounts with Brent. Go ahead, Brent.
Okay. I don't know how many outsiders do we have on? Like 4 or 5?
Yeah.
Okay. So just as a quick update, if you haven't seen for Podman on Mac, we were able to patch QEMU in Brew and then released Podman 4.02 in Brew. And that comes with the work that Anders did to get 9P working, which it already was for Linux, but now it works for Darwin. And that has seemingly gone very well. We're getting feedback here and there and interesting people trying to test performance and various scenarios. That said, I think that we're still trying to wrap our head around what we should do in the future. If we consider this function to be sort of proof of concept, then if we look at things right now in 4.0, volume mounts are done at a NIT. And that means today that if you want to change a volume mount or delete or add one, you must remove your machine and re-init it. Now, Dan and I had a conversation, and we are very likely to begin. I'll add a Podman machine mount and unmount so that we can do volume mounts after a NIT to eliminate that restriction. And it looks like nothing that's done would stop that at this time. So a couple questions start to linger out from that, which is, what should the default behavior of a machine be? We've kicked around the idea of by default, and generally in Mac OS, I believe it's /users/username. We have contemplated as default the idea that we would mount that exact mount, in other words, the user's home directory, into the Podman machine at that exact same path. So users/users/username in Mac OS would be mounted to /users/username Mac OS username in the VM, so that there was a direct and correlating path. Dan and I have done this a number of times. It works quite well.
Yeah, basically, it's another way to think about it is it's $home on $home inside the VM. The beauty of that is then you can do Podman mount, /file, and everything will just work because your home directory is already mounted into the container. It also doesn't conflict with the default home directory inside of the VM. It's still going to be /home/core, so .ssh keys, things like that. So
what do people think of that idea? Let me just pause there and start soliciting some input. Anybody have an opinion?
I think that's the same that Docker and Lima and others are doing. So that's what people are expecting. It also enables volume mounts to work, as you said.
Okay. Do those other projects allow you to also indicate other mounts?
Yes.
Okay.
In Docker's case, I think it's like a menu choice in the GUI. And in Lima's case, it's a line in the YAML file.
Okay. And you can do that at any time? Like, you don't have to tear it down and start over, or?
I think you will have to reboot, but you don't have to delete the VM.
Okay.
So that's how I think it works. And also you have on some of them, they do name the VM user the same as the user on the host, which is fine on Mac, but becomes a problem on Linux. And then they just rename the home directory of the VM user. So if I'm home/Anders on the host, then my VM account will be home Anders Linux or something. So you have two different home directories if you want. But that's a Linux specific thing due to using the exact same path on both sides of the. On Mac you have a slightly different with a /users instead of /home. Saved by that.
To me, Dan, that's enough compelling evidence to go ahead with what we were thinking.
Yeah.
And including the two commands that I referenced.
Yeah, I think adding the commands is great. I think we should have it in containers.conf because, again, security people might be looking at this as a potential risk so there has to be a way that you disable it. So if we just put the entry in $, is the default volume inside containers.conf, then if people don't like that functionality, they could delete it.
Sure. Okay. So that to me is perfect. Then we can plumb that in, and
Yep.
4.1 should reflect that behavior, assuming we can get the work done.
That would only affect, I think that would only affect new images at that point, right? So if you've already run this, you're not going to get that update. You'd have to you'd have to either destroy your image or use the Podman machine.
Yep.
To add that default.
As of now, that would be very true. Yeah.
I just
The
wanted to
other
check.
question,
Okay, you said 4.1?
Yes.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Go ahead, Bruce.
in Lima, they have the setting of exporting the home directory as read-only due to being afraid that something in the VM would mess up your settings on the host. I'm not sure if that fear is valid or not, but that's also something that people are doing and mounting the home directory read-only.
Is Lima setting $home inside of the VM to that directory?
No.
So we could do. We already have the I guess we could just do a :RO like we do.
But
and that would make easy for the users to understand.
Is that their default, or is that just an
that
option?
is their default, and it destroys some workflows due to, like, the current directory, if you're working out of your home, being read-only inside the container, and that might not be what you're expecting. So
Right.
it does have some impact.
I think it's a bad default, but I think we should support it, so that we should just add a flag that :R0 on our option. So if you want to do that, you can do it.
Okay. I think that wraps us up, Tom.
Okay, great. Thanks, Brent. And Dan, you're up next with our pod create and what happens when you exit.
Okay, so I've been talking to at least Matt about this for a number of years now, and it came up as an issue this week where someone was running a pod and the primary container, what they thought was the primary container, exited, and the pod continued running, and they had expected that the pod would exit. What I would like to see is us add a option to tell basically Podman what to do when a container exits that's running inside of a pod. And I think there's three options for there. Right now, we default to ignore, which basically means that the pod's running and the container exits, the pod continues running. You have to stop the pod. Another one would be that if a container or any container exits, then the pod would exit. So that might be the exit option or the close option. And then the third option, or the third behavior would be that the pod would restart the container. So if you had, this is similar to what like a system D on restart or Podman auto restart, where the pod would be in charge of restarting the container. I think for any individual container inside of the pod, you should be able to override that. So you could say that I don't care if this container exits, don't exit the pod. And so I just wanted to see what people thought of that idea.
I'm very supportive of it. Especially for running pods in System D, it doesn't really make sense to keep the pod running if all the containers exited, because this would mean that once the pod service is started, it will never terminate. So as you mentioned, things like restart policies won't work for such services, independent, even if it exits 0. I even think this should be the default behavior. I see an argument for keeping, I see an argument for keeping the pod running if no container has been added yet. But if the last running container stopped or exited, I would assume a sane default behavior that the pod stops as well.
You don't start Matt, we don't start the container any longer. We used to, when we did Podman Pod Create, we started the containers. We started the infra container. We don't do that anymore, right?
I'm pretty sure we do. I don't think that matters though. I think that's still the same default. Honestly, I don't see why we need an option for this though. It sounds like changing the default to stopping the infra container as long as every other container in this pod has already stopped seems sane. I don't think that we even need an option here. Is there a case where you don't want to do that? Because I can't come up with one.
I think the restart option would be so an auto restart. We don't, at least if we say the container should restart. I mean, I guess we already have a restart option on the container level. So the pod would, if a container exits, then that container should restart.
Right.
Well,
This is
pod
something we
restarts
handle
are-
on the.
Go ahead.
Sorry, man. Yeah, restart policies is something we handle on the container service level already. There we get the exit code, and if it exits non-zero, then we will restart, or depending on whatever we configured in the systemd units.
Right. So I just want to make sure that we don't, if we basically have a rule that says that there's no containers running in a pod, then the infra container goes away. Basically, the pod stops.
Right.
Then we want to make sure that we handle the restart policy.
I would just not stop if there's no container yet, so that we can do something like pod create, pod start, and then incrementally add containers to it. So this would break if the pod would start, if there's no container inside. So this is something. So we should only stop if there's, or the other way around. We shouldn't stop the pod automatically if there's no container inside yet.
Right. There's no container inside.
Right.
But there's one
soon as
container
one has
inside,
been added.
I think as soon as one is, well, the only way we're going to catch this is on the cleanup, when the container cleanup. So when the container cleanup happens, it's going to have to check to see if there's any other containers running in the pod. If there is none, then the container cleanup would also stop the pod. Right
Yeah,
now.
I think that's the only way we do it.
That's the only way we can implement this. So
Right.
And if there's other containers running in the pod, then we just continue to run. So if there's no containers actually running in the pod, then the pod exits. But yeah, I guess having it ignore it is probably a dumb case. I don't think we're not really we're causing a breaking change, but I don't think it's a change that anybody's relying on.
Yeah, I would. So from the systemd perspective, I would tag it as a bug fix even.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm cool if we want to add more policies, but I'm also cool with just changing the default.
I think if we change the default, we don't have to add a new option because we can handle it. We can handle it with the existing restock values of the container.
And it seems like a fairly easy change.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just change cleanup to look to see if there's no other containers running. Kill the pod. Make sure it happens after it checks its own restart policy.
I don't know if this is related, but I've noticed a couple of times on the Mac, the init, what is it, teeny? There'll be like an orphan teeny hanging around. I don't know if that's related, but
it could be.
We're using Catatonit for.
Yeah, that's it.
Or as an init.
That's it.
Oh, really?
And I haven't.
saw orphan Catatonits.
Yeah, and I haven't really dug into it. I mean, it's not one of those things where I do a PS every time I change a pod, but
Yeah,
I'll keep an eye on it if I notice.
yeah. If you notice that's definitely.
If I notice a pattern,
Yeah.
I'll post a bug, but something to keep an eye out. I don't know if that was pre-4 or not, but.
Yep.
Thank you very much.
Tom, I think we're done this section. If you want to, we can open it up to anybody that wants to talk about anything else.
That's it for our topics in advance. Do we have anything from the floor that people want to ask further? Ask about. Brent, you had talked at one point about possibly doing some furrow updates. Nobody else has anything else? Do you want to go ahead with that?
Yeah, I was just waiting to see if anyone had any questions. I think what Tom and I talked about is I could just talk through some of the things that are coming up and what the next few releases might look like.
Sounds
I
great.
say go for it.
Let me pull up one, if you would mind. I'm just going to pull up our notes so that I remember things here. Okay. So as far as 4.0 goes, it's actually been going quite well. We certainly have our bugs, and we expected as such, given the size of that release and all the content that went into it after we branched. Well, before and after. So what we're doing right now is we're sort of prioritizing the work we need to do that's all been deferred since we were all focused on, because we were all focused on getting the release out the door. And as it turned out, when we did this exercise, a lot of what we ended up with were sort of internal things related to CI, related to performance analysis, memory analysis, doing some investigations on some things that we want to do in the future that we're not quite sure how to do yet. And so that actually, the team was quite satisfied by that, because that kind of will give time for 4.0 to bake and see if we can't sort of make the 4.0.x releases all about stability and bug fixes. We also sort of also reached an internal check mark for how many GitHub and Bugzilla issues and bugs. We tried to keep it below a certain number. We've hit that checkpoint. And so Dan doesn't know this, but we were proposing next week that we would solely work on bugs and no new features, and try to put that number down a little further. So that's probably what we're going to end up doing. So the big thing is there's not a lot of new function going on. We've got 2 members of the team working on cosine, and their work will not be altered. They'll continue to go through that. But after, allow me to look here. After that, we have Adi working on rootless integration testing, so that's not outward. John is working on more packaging of Podman Pi for homebrew. And before we get to we've got quite a bit of real good stuff sitting in the shadows here, one of which is a team member, Avashi, is going to work on a function that allows us to take YAML from Podman and actually execute it on a Kubernetes system cluster. So we're looking forward to seeing that. Matt's been working a little bit on Docker Compose v2 and announced in IRC today that he's got that fully working with one patch to Podman. And then we've got some blogs that we really need to get out because people have been kind of clamoring for them. And examples would be using Podman with VS Code and using Podman and GitLab Runner. Those kinds of concepts that, you know, they're not technically code, but they're not technically documentation either. So we will knock those out as soon as we can. And you can expect anything that's kind of a new feature that I mentioned to be coming in 4.1, 4.2 timeframe. We didn't plan out much further than that. If I had to guess, 4.1 is probably 6 weeks out. Would Matt, would you agree? At least 6 weeks?
It could be more like 4. We've had 4.0 has been out for a while now. It's up to you if you want to wait, but I think we could easily do a month and then do a 4.1.
Well, I think we'll make a call in 4 weeks to see if we need to get more to make it a legit release. But I'm comfortable with either way. Dan, do you have anything that you wanted to sprinkle over that?
I would just say, outside of this team, we also have parts of Red Hat and parts of Upstream working on VirtIFS support being added to QEMU. And once that's available, then we allow users to either use Plan 9 or VirtIFS on top of a Mac. So that's I'm trying to coordinate that effort going forward so that we can get that support in. Right now, we've looked at the VirtIFS support that's available via native Mac support, but it doesn't allow us to use multiple UIDs and some of the advanced features that we use. We want to have with Podman, so we prefer to do it via fully open source inside of QEMU. So we have to work with the Upstream QEMU community and the virtualization team inside of Red Hat, who have more expertise in making this happen, and the VirtIFS teams. So that's also ongoing. Whether that's going to happen in one player on the radio.
Dan, would you like me to, at a very high level, mention the other group that we're working with?
Sure.
Okay. So at a very high level, I'm going to be sort of intentionally vague, but we are now getting help from another couple of groups in Red Hat for we'll call it a proper Podman desktop experience. And so they're working away on that. There is a containers on GitHub, there's a containers repo where they're working. So you can go out and take a peek there if you're curious to what they're up to and where things are headed.
It's called GitHub Containers Desktop.
Yeah. So that's good news. I know that some people feel strongly that we don't need it, and some people feel strongly that we do. So we hope to be able to deliver something that makes everyone happy. I'd say that's about what we got, Tom.
Alrighty. Are there any other topics, questions, answers? Right. Well, given that, I'm just going to wrap up then. I will note that I'm voting Chris Evich for the best background today, given St. Patrick's Day, and wish you all a happy St. Patrick's Day. Our next meeting for the Cabal is Thursday, April 21st at 11 a.m. And then our next community meeting is actually going to be before then on Tuesday, April 5th, so just a couple weeks from now. And we're looking for topics for both. So please send me any topics that you'd like to talk about either on the Cabal or on the community meeting. The community meeting is usually more demo based, and this one, as you've seen today, is more talking about design issues for Podman. So with that, I'm going to stop the recording and thank you all for attending today.